Wednesday of the first. That's how the school starts. Which is my mid. That's on my CV. But the is it? You're probably having a delay, like. No, that's not good. I can text it. It's been fine.
Yeah.
Melanie, what hours was the Sunset Cafe?
But I'm actually not, I don't manage anything.
Oh, okay.
So I think there's soft opening.
Morning, everybody. How's it going?
Hey.
Good. Right on. Yeah, on time. Oh, everyone's ready to rip around, ready to go. To the folks online, can you hear me? Maybe give me a thumbs up. Can you hear me? Right on. Welcome to the official community plan steering committee meeting for Tuesday, June 25th, 2024. And thank you for joining. I'd like to start in a good way by acknowledging with gratitude that we live and work on the traditional unceded territory of the Squamish, whose people have been stewards of these lands and waters surrounding the Quilliam, Bowen Island. And very important to recognize, I think, given the events on Friday and the recognition and the awareness generated in the community, and especially as we move forward with an official community planning process that deals with everything from the fabric of our community to land use, the memory of reconciliation and the work that we need to carry forward in that is always, I think, important to keep top of mind. And with that, I will look to our coordinator for the introductions and late items today.
We just have supporting material, which was the draft request for proposals to support discussion item number 5.1.
Great. So that's an introduction. We'll add that as supporting material to the agenda. Yes.
I mean, procedural, be allowed to add in late items from before.
Yes, as long as I believe we can, as long as it's unanimously approved by the committee.
So can I put some report? Okay. I was just wondering if we could put a discussion forward on the appointment of a committee chair.
On which one?
Committee appointment for the chair for the committee.
Yep.
7.2.
7.2. Great. So we've added 7.2, and I will look for a motion from the committee to adopt the agenda as amended. Moved by David, seconded by Adam. Any discussion? Seeing none, I will call the question. All in favor, raise your hands. Say aye. Aye, and that carries. Next, 2.1, adoption of the minutes. Can I have a motion that the minutes of the OCP steering committee meeting held June 3rd, 2024 be adopted? Moved by Mr. Lougheed. We'll take Fritz as the seconder. Any discussion, changes, additions, amendments to the minutes? Seeing none, I will call the question. All in favor, raise your hand, say aye. And that carries. We'll look to our coordinator for any public comments today.
I don't have any public comments.
Okay. And then getting right into the meat of our meeting of delegations 4.1, we have Joe Elliott, the Alliance Trust Senior Indigenous Relations Advisor, joining us today. Welcome, Mr. Elliott.
Okay, hi, Chad. Thank you. Much appreciation. Before I get started, I'll just briefly introduce myself. My Comoxnat is Tuakult, which originates from Snuneymuxw, and I traditionally, follow the principles of our teachings is to introduce yourself and who I am and where my family name comes from. I am Cowichan and I reside on traditional territory Cowichan tribes. I have many connections throughout the island, from Snuneymuxw to Seattle, and in various aspects in regards to our name and our belongings to the islands that you continue to work for and ensure that there's protection of the lands is done in a good way. With the presentation, I'm working with Claire Frater, my supervisor. I'm really new. I'm not new to engagement, but I'm new to land planning. And so Claire's here to support myself and to provide and to ensure that what is shared is shared in a good way to the audience. So Heichka, thank you. Claire.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Claire Frater. I've met some of you before. I'm the Director of Trust Area Services with Islands Trust, and as part of one of my many responsibilities is general oversight of our work to advance reconciliation within Islands Trust and provide support to Bowen Island Municipality. So here today in support of Joe, and we have a PowerPoint to provide to you, and we're going to take turns with the various slides. So perhaps I'll turn to the room and see if you're ready for me to start that off. Would that be right now if I start sharing screen?
Yep, absolutely. Go ahead.
All right, I'm seeing some nods.
Yes.
All right, are you seeing it at your end?
Yep. Yep.
Terrific. Okay. Oh, we'll start.
Can you move the little things on the side and just show the main part of this? There we go. Perfect.
There you are. All right. All right. So, Joe and I are here today to speak with you regarding your plans for the development of OCP amendments, I believe. And so I'll hand it over. Oh, no, I think we were going to. Yeah, so here we are, and I will move us to the next slide here, which is to generally share. This is the Islands Trust acknowledgement that we share in many of our meetings, which notes that Islands Trust and Islands Trust Conservancy respectfully acknowledge that the lands and waters that encompass the Islands Trust area have been home to Indigenous people since time immemorial, and their deep connection to the islands continues to this day. We are committed to reconciliation, to upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples, and to working together to preserve this ecologically, culturally, and spiritually significant region in the Salish Sea. And you'll see there we are located in the treaty and territorial lands of many Coast Salish First Nations. So this guides the work that we do, and I think is really, you're going to see is really embedded in the advice and the work that we're going to undertake today. So generally, I think most of you are aware, but Bowen Island Municipality operates as an island municipality within the umbrella of Islands Trust. And generally, Islands Trust is a special purpose provincial government agency with a mandate to preserve and protect the Islands Trust area and unique amenities and environment. So again, that provides the general framework for conversations around the official community plan. And the object of the Islands Trust, which is specified in our legislation, is to preserve and protect the trust area and its unique amenities and environment for the benefit of the residents of the trust area and of British Columbia generally, in cooperation with municipalities, regional districts, improvement districts, First Nations, and other persons and organizations, and the government of British Columbia. In 2021, our act was amended to add First Nations to the object, and I will just bring that to your attention on the next slide here, because here in the Islands Trust Act is what the municipality must consider. And so in section 39.1, it states that the Council of a municipality must have regard for the object in adopting a bylaw or issuing a permit or license. So with the change to the object to now include First Nations as a body that must be cooperated with, it behooves us all to turn our minds to how we're going to do that cooperation in the development of a new OCP bylaw. I don't know the municipality has yet turned its mind to how it wants to cooperate in issuing of permits and licenses, but for today, we'll keep our eye on bylaws. And I'm now going to turn it over to Joe Elliott to present around the Indigenous learning pathway that informs our work.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. And I think it's really important that to have an understanding of the learning towards our First Nations people and Indigenous population. And it really begins at a cultural awareness, and the cultural learning pathway has been since First Nations, maybe the past 30 years and longer, have always been sharing our culture and who we are as people. So cultural awareness recognizes and acknowledges the existence of different cultures, practices, and worldviews. It's usually learned through histories, the values, the traditions of different cultures, and it's usually done through readings, the media, and interaction. So it's the learning that we have towards First Nations people. Cultural sensitivity is understanding appreciation of cultural difference and being aware of how one's active can affect peoples from different cultures. So it's a greater understanding of other cultures and perspectives. And we have to remind ourselves this is based on limited knowledge that we have towards First Nation population. Cultural competencies is developing skills and knowledge to interact effectively and respectfully with people of different cultures. And I think a lot of our Island Trust municipalities are looking at that's where we're at. How do we interact with First Nations people, and how can we do it in a respectful way? And what is the best way to build that relationship with the First Nations communities? So it's and it's usually done through formal education or cultural competency education programs or workshops, and it develops our interaction skills, and it's also seeking feedback from our relationship that we have with the First Nations communities. And cultural safety is creating an environment where individuals feel safe, their cultural identity, knowledge is valued, and participation without fear of discrimination or racism is done in there's free of racism and discrimination through that relationship and our interaction with the First Nations communities. Next slide, Claire. And I really appreciate the start off with the land protocol with land acknowledgement. And we'll also need to look at some of the historical impacts, the loss of land and resources, the loss of culture, the community fragmentation that exists between some of our islands, and our relationship that once existed where our nations worked together, they collaborated, they had meetings, they had potlatches, they shared their laws and teachings within that setting. And that became fragmented after years of interaction. And the political and legal marginalization is that our First Nation people have our laws and ways of doing things, but it's not fully accepted into our today's realm of interaction. And the First Nations forced to smaller reserves and restricted the traditional land use practices to some of the islands. Next slide, Claire.
So or did you want to take this one, Joe?
No, go ahead, Claire. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things I think we wanted to talk to you about today was new provincial legislation you're probably all aware of, which is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So this act has 4 key areas within it. Section 3 mandates the BC government to bring provincial laws into alignment with the UN Declaration. However, the act does not put a time frame on this. So it's sort of up to the province to develop an action plan, which is Section 4 here. And so the province has sort of given itself 5-year action plans where they take a bite of the very big project of doing what's mandated under Section 3. And so in the first 5-year action plan, they didn't bring about any changes to legislation relating to Islands Trust or Bowen Island Municipality specifically. Where they did look at local government was around regional districts particularly, and around naming of place names. So they looked at regional district structure and the naming, but not generally local governments. So that will be important to know as we move forward in this presentation. Section 5 requires them to monitor their progress and report out on how they're doing. And then also interestingly, Section 6 and 7 allow the province to enter into agreements with a broad range of Indigenous governments so that you can exercise statutory decision-making authority together. In some of my meetings that I've been having with nations about the Islands Trust, they have expressed some interest in this tool, but it would be for the nation to speak with the province about any shared decision-making that would affect Islands Trust or Bowen Island Municipality planning. So at this time, there have been very few of these agreements, only I think 2 or 3 that have been struck with the province so far. So we're really in early days here, looking at how the tool might be used. And to my knowledge, there hasn't yet been a use of this tool that would affect local government decision-making. And I understand there's been a council motion around the implementation of UNDRIP. So for now, it's a really gray area. What we're understanding is that there's an emerging understanding of what the Declaration Act might bring to local government, but there's currently no mandate, as we understand it, to comply with UNDRIP. There are a number of articles here that we've listed that are particularly material to land use decision-making, but there's currently like caution around moving to a place of consent because we're not sure how that would happen within the current local government legislative framework. So we'll just offer caution there. But certainly if you read through UNDRIP and you get the understanding of what's being called for there in terms of strong relationship and friendship and trying to right past wrongs and really empower nations to share their knowledge and work in a collaborative, meaningful way together, regardless of whether you can, move to a place of consent yet, certainly you can move a long way in that direction and be well positioned for the future by building strong relationships with the nations and really coming to meaningfully understand their perspectives as we undertake this planning work. I'll move there, and hopefully if we move quickly, we'll have time for questions towards the end here. So I was going to pass this back to Joe, if you're right, around best practices when we're engaging.
Yeah, if we can look at some of the best practices, reaching out to the nations to see how they wish to and interact early in the process. Develop a plan for engaging with First Nations that is informed with their input. Nothing for us without us. Host relationship building events outside of the public meeting process, perhaps field trips where you can interact and build a relationship, where the members can identify and the First Nation can identify the things they wish to see, and consider capacity funding for First Nations to support the participation in the OCP amendment process.
And certainly
Thanks,
this is something we can circle back to. Do you want me to take this one, Joe?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay. This was one where there are some practical steps that might be considered. As Joe mentioned, it's great to engage early and continuously throughout the process. And also, this is where it gets really tricky with our Western often expectations of time frame. Respecting First Nation protocols and their own timelines can be difficult when we have sort of a fixed project charter and we wish to keep within it. Building relationship often requires stepping outside of that fixed approach to things. With capacity building, Islands Trust has been piloting a project to provide capacity funding to nations to enable their participation. And it's been going quite well in terms of seeking engagement. We've been working with Squamish Nation around the Gambier official community plan and provided capacity funding there and enabled a really good relationship early in that process, such that the local trust committee is receiving feedback early from Squamish Nation around their values and interests for that process. And also providing resources and training outside of that as needed to support their participation. We're always encouraging protocol agreements, and that's something we could talk with further because the Islands Trust Act provides for protocol agreements with nations in terms of how to define roles and responsibilities as we move forward, and also how to handle disputes should they arise. Also incorporation of traditional knowledge into land use planning, right into documents and policies where possible, and also into the land management regime that comes into play. This has been a great area of learning for me, and I really see the value here of really reaching out to understand in a different way a relationship to environment and land through the perspective of traditional knowledge. It's really, I think, benefits land use planning to undertake that work. And then finally, monitoring and evaluation as you undertake relationship building and as the municipality reaches out. It's good to evaluate on an ongoing basis. How is that going? What have we learned? And how can it feed into ongoing improvements to the official community plan? And I'll pass it back to Joe here.
And then other considerations include a formal statement recognizing the First Nations rights and the land acknowledgement in the OCP documents and other documents. And some of the benefits that we really could look at is, the strengthened relationships will foster a more respectful relationship. It supports integration of traditional knowledge and Indigenous values, and it supports the preservation and revitalization of the First Nations culture and traditions. And that's, thank you.
So I was going to take a minute here and just show you, this is the list of nations that we pulled. I didn't have an opportunity to pull a fresh list, but in June of 2023, this was the list of nations that the provincial database was showing as having territory either for land or marine around Bowen Island. So Cowichan tribes, Halalt, Lake Cowichan, Liaxin, Musqueam, Penelakut, Sinemuk, Squamish, Stumanus, and Tsleil-Waututh. And so the reason I mentioned that is here's how bylaw approval processes work. And you may have already covered this with Bowen Island staff, but I thought I'd take a minute to walk you through this, how it works with Islands Trust. So as a bylaws in development, Islands Trust and Bowen Island municipality staff informally discuss the approach and work collaboratively together. Once Bowen moves to first reading of an OCP bylaw, it gets sent to Islands Trust Executive Committee for comment before it goes to public hearing. After that, once it's been sent through to the Executive Committee for approval, they have to look and see whether it's consistent with the policy statement. For Bowen Island, that's all they can consider. Interestingly, for our local trust committees, Executive Committee has a broader range of things to consider. But for Bowen, it's simply whether it's compliant or not, or consistent with the policy statement. Bowen can then move ahead with a public hearing and gives it second and third reading. It then goes back to the Executive Committee for final approval, and then it can be approved and Bowen can adopt it. However, if the Executive Committee does not approve it, Bowen can refer it to Trust Council. If Trust Council returns it or refuses to approve it for some reason, it can be submitted to the minister. Should it end up at the minister is going to have a broader range of considerations, which would potentially include what level of engagement happened with nations, which is why I showed you the earlier slide around the province's interest is triggered with all of the nations. So that's something for probably staff to staff further conversation as you sort of work forward, but just wanted to draw that to your attention. So I think we were able to stay until about 11:30 today, and we apologize for the shortened amount of time. We had another meeting pop up that really demands our attention. So we hoped we could get in a few questions, and certainly we'd be more than happy to come back again another time.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'll just look around the room here to the committee for questions. We'll start with Chris.
You can always count on me to have a question. The Squamish Nation Sacred Land Use Plan. Going back a few years ago, I was aware that the Squamish Nation was working on updating their land use plan. Has it now been finalized and sort of recognized? No.
That is not something I know specifically, but we could look into that and get back to you.
Okay, yeah, I'd be curious to know sort of what stage it's at in terms of it being finalized or not. My second question also is you're referring to tracking First Nation engagement. Of course, there's a formal way of tracking consultation and engagement. Are you recommending that the committee also formally track our engagement and consultation with First Nations in regards to the OCP?
I think it's certainly recommended. It's a best practice. And should you end up in a place where you need to go to the minister, it would be beneficial to have. It's also very useful in terms of questions coming from community to be able to explain in a transparent way who you've had conversations with and, on what time frame.
Thank you.
Over to you, James.
Thank you. Question for you. You mentioned that Gambier is currently in their OCP process and have been engaging with Islands Trust around Indigenous consultation. Has there been any other of your, do you call them member islands or members that have been through the process or are currently engaged in the process?
So at this time, with regard to OCP development, Gambier is the one that's been working with Squamish, particularly. Salt Spring Island is about to head into a big engagement with a number of nations. They've got up to 13 nations to engage with. So they are just at the beginning stages. And Denman and Hornby are also at beginning stages of collaborating around official community plan amendments for with particularly working with Comox First Nation, but also others. So I would say the Gambier model is probably the one to look to. And the results of that early engagement are public. I've shared them with, I can't remember your title, with Daniel Martin around, so that the committee could certainly have a look at that engagement table that's been produced and have an early look at the values that have come from Squamish, although certainly don't encourage relying on that and instead going and having a meeting directly to seek their feedback.
Chair, I have a follow-up if that's okay.
Absolutely.
With respect to Gambier, you said that they've been engaging with Squamish. I'm going to make the assumption that their list of other nations is probably fairly similar to ours. And so my question would be, has Island Trust ever helped them with, is it through, and I may not be getting the terminology correct, like a strength of claim of what level of deep engagement you need to have with the various nations? What guidance can we look to, either through Islands Trust, or is there some work that we need to do in order to determine what level of engagement with the various nations?
So that's a really tricky question. I won't attempt to answer it all here. It was a pilot project for us. So we picked various nations to pilot offering capacity funding to and getting early engagement results. So it was, deemed that Squamish Nation would be a great example for a pilot to work with Gambier. So in terms of strength of claim, that's something beyond what I can advise on, and we really look to the province to help guide us there. But really, when we go to the minister with a bylaw, the minister is looking to see that we engaged with every nation, regardless of how we might assess strength of claim. So it is prudent to reach out to all nations and have them determine for themselves what level of engagement they'd like to see. What we have found in practice has been that certain nations step forward more strongly than others, and others will say they'll defer to a different nation to provide the primary commentary, has been our experience, but we don't ever want to prejudge what that might look like.
Okay, thank you. Adam and then David.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Claire. Just a quick question about roles and responsibilities with the engagement. How does that work? Does Islands Trust lead the initial sort of like relationship building and then leaves it to the local government to manage, or are they involved throughout?
So I'll take that, Joe, if that's okay. Bowen Island is the only island municipality within Islands Trust. And so I think we'd be co-creating this together in terms of what support Islands Trust might offer. The local trust committees do lean into Joe and myself for some support, and Bowen certainly could do that as well, because you pay into the trust area services service. So we are available, as we would be to the local trust committees, to assist Bowen within reason, within our work programs as it might work. So I think we are available to assist, but I think it's up to Bowen Island Municipality to create its own relationships as a body, as we are doing for all the local trust committees. So we're here to support, but we would not be front facing for you. We would support you or support the municipality in stepping out on its own, I would think.
What could that support actually look like? What does support assistance look like?
I think that's for us to discuss. It could, having Joe there as an advisor, I think, and help you as he walked through that slide around cultural competency and cultural sensitivity work. He may be able to assist with some training around getting everyone feeling comfortable and ready to go do that engagement. We could share with you some of our templates that we have, tracking sheets for engagement, and sort of that administrative back end. And we're always there for advice and support. But I think we could talk about that further and see what might be available.
Thank you. Over to you, David.
Thank you for your presentation. My question turns out to be a follow-up to all the other questions, which is whether the Islands Trust could act as a referral or a contact source for us for the best people at the affected nations, best people to contact or the best office.
Certainly, yes, we can share that information. We have the names of all the referral clerks, and some of the nations have what's called a portal, sort of a web entry where you have to register an account and then submit the GIS layers and your request through a portal, and we could share all the instructions for registering for those.
Thank you.
Looking around the table for any other questions. Councilor Morse?
Question sort of related. My understanding is that as far as land dealings, the Squamish Nation has, through discussions with all the other interested nations, they are the ones that have Bowen in their traditional territory. So the others are all for water territories. And so I guess the follow-up question is there a different level of consultation the province wants if it's water versus land?
So as I understand it, really, things change all the time and different nations are negotiating with the province at different times. So what may have been true a few months ago may not be true a few months from now. So it's always worthwhile going into that consultative areas database and running an updated report to see what comes out. As far as your OCP goes, if your amendments are land-based only, then you would narrow up the search to see what nations consider it to be their territory to be affected to land only. If the official community plan amendments are going to stretch out and affect marine areas, then you'd want to scope in all those nations. Again, I believe it's for the nations themselves to tell you whether they choose to defer to another lead nation or not around the comments. It's not for me to advise you on that. It's really for the nations to speak for themselves as part of a referral and say whether they wish to engage deeply or not and on what part of their territory.
And I think you may have answered this and I didn't catch it. Are our nations exactly the same as the ones that Gambier? On their list?
Again, likely to be similar, but it is funny how you draw the geographic boundaries. Nations, there may be a slight difference, but I expect you could expect the list to be quite similar. But really, you have to draw that boundary, and we drew it, 6 months apart for Gambier, and found for the marine area, all of a sudden we had like 5 or 6 new nations that showed up last summer because they had changed their boundaries with regard to engagement with the province. So it's worth running on a regular basis to make sure that you're capturing the most recent expression of interest from nations. And again, that's something we can assist with for sure.
Just looking at the time here, I know you folks said that you needed to be out by 11:30, so I don't want to step too far over that line, but just to wrap up and say thank you for presenting. It was great to have the Islands Trust here, and your offers of support and assistance are very much appreciated, and we certainly look forward to working with you throughout this process. So thank you for the presentation today.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. We are here to support. This is part of what you are part of the Islands Trust. This is a service that we offer in support of Bowen. So certainly happy to be here, happy to come again, and happy to provide any follow-up that might be needed. And I'll get back to you around the Squamish Nation land use plan.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks all. And I appreciate you accommodating our pile up of meeting schedules today.
Excellent.
Okay, moving on to maybe I'll just any comments, discussions, questions around the presentation before we move on. See James with his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. It just, I guess it's more of a comment, maybe a question to staff. I guess I was a little bit surprised at seeing the list of the nations that were on the slide. Surprised and not surprised. Only because I've had to deal with this in my past life. And so I guess the question I have is that, do we think we would have enough support from Islands Trust to help us maneuver through Indigenous consultation? Or is that almost a bit of a separate piece of work that we might need that is, I think, beyond sort of the main OCP consultant? Maybe just something that it's just sort of thinking about. I think that we could be open to debate on this one, so I don't want to really bring that up yet, but it does sort of dawn on me as you go through that we might need some specialized advice just on Indigenous consultation for the plan.
Yep.
Happy to field that with Daniel's support. It's a really good question, and I too was surprised to see that list. It's not the list of First Nations that I understand that have claim over the land and waters that surround the island. So I will be following up directly with Claire after this meeting to find out where she generated that list from. Because when I look to my sources, that doesn't show up. And so, but I look forward to getting clarity on that. And I also agree, though, that even without that longer list, we would still benefit from additional help and support. And there is some funding through the Islands Trust, as well as directly through the Union of BC Municipalities that we can turn to for this type of engagement. Because I do think we will need that additional support. And our staff are small but mighty, and so if we want to have a meaningful engagement, we're going to need that additional capacity.
Just a quick follow-up. I think it was mentioned at a previous meeting, the community forum funding.
Yeah.
Have we done that previously as well? Or- Okay. Because I believe that does include eligible costs for.
Yeah.
Consultation.
That's through the UBCM. It's funding from the province that's managed by UBCM.
Any other questions or comments? Councillor Morse?
Will we get the slides? Will you ask Claire for the slides?
I was just gonna say, I was building sort of follow-up material to circulate after the meeting. So one thing is the staff report on the Gambier OCP consultation process is interesting, and they have a table at the end or document where they can determine they've identified jointly, like, these are high priority items, these are medium priority items, these are low priority items. And it's an interesting read to see, okay, this is through that consultation process with Squamish, what was identified as high priority in their OCP review.
Okay. Thank you for that. Moving on to subcommittee reports. So we have 5.1, the RFP drafting subcommittee report. Who am I turning this over to here?
I just put, I asked Glenn to report on the activity of the subcommittee, just to give the members a
Okay.
chance to have a voice, and then possibly Daniel will take over with the actual RFP, which I will share on screen. Yeah, thanks, Glenn.
I can't remember the specific date, but Kirsten, James and myself, they were available to some good healthy conversation, sharing of perspectives. In some cases, it was, sharing different perspectives, but ultimately, solid alignment in making some recommendations that I hope were helpful to Daniel. It looks like he's incorporated most of them, if not all of them, into the draft revised documents. So maybe I'll turn it over to yeah, so we worked on the draft document. I'll say I had hoped to have it actually honestly like posted by now. I haven't, and then thought, okay, we'll bring it for discussion as well for this meeting. But looking maybe then by end of this week, and then looking to close the end of July. It's kind of defining to be 4 weeks to be end of July. One of the big focus points and helpful feedback from the subcommittee was on talking through the work plan that's within it. So some work expanding the background, and then some work going through what are deliverables, what are the budget scopes of the project. What do we expect this consultant to do? Including sort of, almost the first step being provide the detailed work plan and engagement plan. So we're giving some ideas of like what should be in this. Let's say we'll
Share it, or is it?
Because I think I'm skimming through it, so I don't follow. What else? One of the things we talked about is what role I think the chosen consultant, what is their role, I guess, presenting to this committee or presenting to council, knowing that sort of that builds into the consultant's like budget. And so some of the feedback from council was that maybe the appropriate is just the draft bylaw itself. When the draft plan is done, that's presented to council by the consultants, but otherwise they'd be working with this committee. And then if council wants to engage, they can continue to join the meetings or watch the meetings. Yeah, other than that, mostly the work plan is kind of how we talked about in terms of the phasing of the work plan. So a first phase being looking at vision of the OCP, or I think that is phase 2. So phase 1 being background and building that engagement report. Phase 2 being the gathering of ideas. So looking at primarily things around like the vision of the OCP. Phase 3 being talking about scenarios and options. And yes, some of that kind of work through like, okay, based on what we heard, what are different scenarios for going forward?
Phase 4 then being actually drafting the plan itself and doing feedback on that. And then phase 5 being, actually adopting the plan. So we have a plan, we need a bylaw, it needs to go through the bylaw adoption process. What else did I say? The other thing that we talked about and worked in is just this idea that knowing that based on our budget, available budget, it's like it may be ambitious for this. And so putting in that it's anticipated municipal staff and volunteers will provide support in the process. It's describing your work plan, your expectations for the role of staff and OCP steering committee members in order to complete the program within the project budget. And I'll say sort of what we'd envisioned by that was the idea being that like if the consultant comes in, we have an engagement plan that's been developed. Say, okay, we're going to do workshops, we're going to do, pop-up events to gain feedback and stuff. It's like, well, maybe the consultant, and probably the consultant isn't actually manning the booth on those times, but it could be municipal staff or volunteers or some combination of those. So the idea being that we're not, paying the consultant to come sit on the ferry to come over to set up, to do it, to go back, but rather if they said, this is the engagement material for an event, and then it's like, well, municipal staff now are going to ride the ferry to engage with commuters on the morning shift or something like that. So we're not paying the consultant wage to do all of that, but then we're collecting it for and the consultant will help in that analysis of it. Yeah, I think that was most of what I had to say about the RFP. I know I just sent the draft around last night, so people probably haven't had a chance to look at it. If questions come up or people are wondering what's included or what should be included, free to chime in.
Yeah, I guess I was just reflecting on the presentation that we had. I'm not sure if it probably captures the Indigenous component quite sufficiently, and I guess that's one thing we need to do is answer. I think it was Jim asked the question about, is that a separate exercise or is that an expectation of these folks? If it's an expectation, well, I guess we need to offer some clarity, guidance on that process. Given the number of nations that were listed there, and my experience always has been that it's government to government kind of relationships, right? So it's not, the First Nations aren't wrapped into the general public. So it is kind of a dedicated process that can take some strategy in itself. So I guess that's before the RFP moves out. I guess we'll have to have some clarity on that.
After you. You guys can rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because, you have one bucket, which is developing the relationship with First Nations, which we really can't contract out. That can't be a consultant, and that can't be either part of this or. And then the other bucket is from a land use point of view, where you are sort of ticking off those boxes in terms of what's expected in terms of consultation and engagement. And then, of course, there's the administrative process of making sure that you're tracking it properly and being consistent. So I do see that as maybe a whole other process meeting with the committee to just talk about how those pieces all do fit together. Although I wouldn't say that for this consultant, the engagement piece, that ultimate responsibility should be with this organization or this person. I think it's something that their processes need to be integrated with an overall process, but to figure out, maybe there's a point person on our committee that would then take the lead in the relationship building and working closely with that consultant who's supporting Indigenous relations, because it is a relationship piece. Or maybe there's a member of council who's also on the OC committee who wants to be involved in that relationship building. There's a number of different ways of figuring it out, and I just propose that we do that as a separate meeting or conversation another time.
James.
I agree with all that. Just a quick question about our existing relationship with Squamish, assuming we have one. So like, we wouldn't be self, I don't know, like, we're not starting from scratch. Ish. Okay.
And would, sorry to intrude on the order, but would council want to lead that relationship process and we then tail on, or?
Yeah, that's a great question about the existing relationship. So it is there. I wouldn't characterize it as very deep. I think there are a number of pieces stacking up for local government, within Bowen Island that we need to engage with on the Squamish. There's pieces around emergency planning. There's pieces around the OCP development. There's pieces around a possible protocol agreement. So all of these things can be brought to Squamish. The timing is tricky. So one of the pieces you heard in the presentation is that relationships with Indigenous communities can move on a different time scale, particularly, if we have something really rote and defined that might not line up. So it's something that both staff and myself have been looking at building that relationship. And there hasn't been a lot of movement there or on the table from Squamish. So we do need to redouble our efforts, but the invitation has been open to Squamish.
Just a quick follow-up, like I agree that it probably is worth a longer discussion. Especially as it relates to like the timeline, like you mentioned, like a protocol agreement, the city of Vancouver signed one recently, I think it took 3-4 years to like develop it. TransLink has a meeting today later with Squamish, and it took us like 8 months to schedule this. So I do worry about what is possible within a pretty ambitious timeline for the OCP as well.
Right. So one of the, something, this is the conversation that Daniel and I have been having as well, is there's the multiple threads of the OCP, the lenses that we're looking at of the sustainable development goals, circular economy, and then the reconciliation piece. I did reach out to SCARP, so UBC's School of Community and Regional Planning, to see if they might be interested in participating in the OCP process in some way, shape, or form. And they are. They gave us, and so these have been very recent meetings. I don't know how it's going to fit in, but they've got graduate studio projects. They have Indigenous relationships as well that they could participate in. And one of the thoughts that I've had and I've processed through Daniel, I don't want to speak for Daniel, so Daniel's like, Mayor, what you're saying is absolutely off the charts. Feel free to put that in there. But doing the best that we can at this point, and then perhaps the work of the committee progresses with the other lenses, and if we can, bring in SCARP to help frame some of our Indigenous relation pieces over this next academic year, there might be a process available then to, whatever work that we do, we do our best work and then we reinterpret that work through the lens of reconciliation in a way that we're not waiting for the reconciliation piece first and have that stall us, because there's also a piece, I think, that we heard from the presentation today that like there's an intersection of personal development work as well for this committee when we talk about cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, and what that means. I think there's biases that we probably all bring to the table here that we're not even aware of, and there's some work that needs to be done on that. And trying to do everything front end might be a bit challenging.
So just my last thing, I know I don't jibber jabbering too much, but on the SCARP thing, the program is the Indigenous Community Planning Program. Like they have a separate stream for it. My partner is a graduate of it and works for the gentleman who started that program. And also my partner's been working with Squamish for like 4 years now. So maybe I can like help to
Hello, Adam.
Facilitate that and like make some connections on that front.
Absolutely.
I don't know who, but maybe Daniel or follow up.
Yeah. And we can walk our dogs together.
Yeah.
I had written a few comments on the draft, and one of them was like, the purpose of this isn't actually to solve the reconciliation, how we're gonna do it, but we should be giving signals to the people that are applying to do this job, that that's gonna be one of the things they grapple with. So I did think under engagement that we did need to mention that we have a responsibility there in terms of reconciliation. And another one I kind of flagged for myself was the whole idea of engagement. Two examples came to mind, what happened with Cape Roger Curtis and the current ferry engagement process. And I remember a lot of us having that feeling after Cape Roger Curtis engagements, Metro Vancouver engagements, a long wait, and then we got a published document and we all sort of went, oh, they heard this or they didn't hear that. And what I'm watching with BC Ferries is they met with the Ferry Advisory Committee, who were consulting with the larger transportation committee and getting priorities from Bowen Island. What I liked was the feedback loop that came in the last couple of weeks, which was to everybody. The committees come up with these priorities or interests on time sailing, whatever your issues are. There were 4 or 5 of them. How would you prioritize this? Do you agree? And like a short space made a comment so that you felt with engagement that it was reciprocal, that it wasn't all one way. And I felt like the way this was written in terms of engagement doesn't include that notion of a reciprocal engagement. I don't think we want an engagement where it's all us telling the community what we're doing. We want to take the community's creativity and passion and uniqueness and feed it back into our process. So I don't think engagement stands by itself is the bottom line of that long comment. Some words I came up with were reciprocal or formative. I just think we have to be a little bit more expansive of what we mean by engagement. And there's lots of protocols out there that some of them might fit us. I had marked the thing about what does this committee do? What does community do? What does a consultant do? I think we can be more specific. And I found that particularly under identified steps. I think there's some places that we could delineate that a little bit. I'll stop there.
Oh, that's great. It's great feedback. James?
Yeah, so maybe taking us back a bit to the actual RFP and how we deal with that. I think I think it was Kirsten who was making these points, but I think that we need to be careful not to imply that the role of the consultant will be to deal all things with Indigenous consultation, or otherwise you might as well just use your entire budget for that. And then also sort of be recognize that if I'm correct in knowing where the relationship is right now, even with Squamish and Bowen, there's still a long road to go to have then, let's say, a relationship that you can have that will provide really quick, meaningful input into an OCP. So I think we're all on a long road is what I'm trying to say. And so be sort of realistic that there's going to be steps along that way if you want to have an OCP in the timelines that you have identified so far. And that's okay. It's a journey, it's a path, right? But knowing that you can't, it doesn't mean to say, oh, well, we're never going to do that. We kind of have to, and you can't, legally, you can't give up, but we're going to do minimal effort that would get us by. We're not saying that either. But knowing that these could go on 2 different kind of paths and recognize that, and so therefore, looping it back to what's at hand, the RFP, we need, and I think it is signaled in there around First Nation consultation, but not an expectation or that this consultant is delivering all of that for you. Does that make sense? So I think that, I mean, I know that there's going to be lots of conversations, and I'm sure this OCP may be a catalyst to it, but it won't be the end. if it is a long-term relationship that you're hoping to build with the nations that have an interest.
Thank you, James. Over to you, Lynn.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to follow up and I've heard some really great comments and it's really pleasing to know that this level of thought and consideration is going into all of this. And I couldn't agree more with what you're saying, James and Betty. You, I think, really to paraphrase what you said, I think really nails it in that this OCP is not reconciliation in and of itself. It is a part of that journey, which is a lifelong journey. And that's, just a first, or maybe not the first, but a step towards the place where we want to get towards. And I couldn't agree more that we're not going to achieve like a reconciliation is different for everybody individually and every nation individually and every community. And so we're not going to achieve that with this project, but we're going to move towards it, whatever that is. And we have to be really clear with the consultant that we want to do our very best to engage thoughtfully, meaningfully with the nation. And we're going to lean on other resources wherever we can to try to help that. And at the end of the day, we're going to be hopeful that we did get some meaningful engagement. And at the very least, I'd say that we've improved the relationship such that we can actually call on each other more easily than we can today. And to me, that would be a great measure of success. But ultimately, it'll be up to the nation to say whether or not we've met their needs and whether or not they're concerned about this OCP going forward or not. And that's all we can really do. So. We just keep trying. Yeah.
Councilor Getty.
There's some really good guidance in some of the comments in the third and fourth documents that have been attached to the delegation in terms of future planning. I think that if we have a consultant or we tell the consultant that we want to keep those kinds of future planning principles in mind, I think that would establish and help a foundation in terms of us being open to their guidelines and principles. So I think that's good, helpful information that we can, even if we struggle with building some sort of an open, easy relationship, that we can still work towards something that they've given us, they've described in terms of what's important to them.
Thank you. So Mr. Martin.
If people have any like written comments they want to share with, they could do so.
You have a deadline for that?
So here's my deadline is that I'm off tomorrow. I'm off until like 3rd. So I'm either posting it today, or Friday, I guess, remotely, or I'm not doing it the following week. And then so I just count it out. And if I post it July 4th, 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks is August 1st to close the. So I start running like through the summer.
Personally,
Yeah.
I think it's better to get it out.
Yeah.
And because we still know part of this process is that if there's any questions, that we could do a follow-up session later on.
Yeah.
And if there's any opportunity to issue clarifications later on, we can do that as well. And at the end of the day, when we actually do get proposals in, there's going to be a lot of room to ask questions and even, further tailor what we're looking for. That's my opinion. I think we should just get it. I think we've got a time issue and everybody disappears and still on August.
I agree completely with that, and I would encourage Daniel to do it before leaving rather than while you're away.
So doing that essentially, if it's like by the end of the week, then it'd be closing July 26th, which might be perfect if we have the next tentative schedule, I think our agenda was July 29th. But maybe instead we're doing a closed, once that's closed to review submissions, but if that works out, that would be good timing in terms of keeping us on track.
Nods around the room, sounds like it. Post today. Don't deal with it on your vacation.
So written comments in by 1.
But yeah,
Maybe for a couple more.
yeah.
So is there gonna be anything in here on First Nations relations?
So I think I think I agree with Kristen, like, it's almost something I don't want to like hire a consultant to go build a relationship. That's just right thing that you can do. So I think more maybe it's including language about it's like, we're flagging from the plan will incorporate feedback that arrives through that process. So it's like the consultant isn't doing that, but we're saying, well, but when you're drafting the plan, obviously it's going to include something around that is probably what I would include.
Everyone seems satisfied.
Good work.
Good. Yeah, thank you for putting it together, Daniel, and thank you for the subcommittee for pulling together the meeting as well. 6.1 work plan follow-up. The updated draft work plan to be provided as a late item. I don't know if that was provided, but are there comments on the work plan, Daniel?
Yeah, I don't have anything beyond what's in the RFP. Essentially, that was our updated work plan. I was working on that, and I don't know. Yeah, there's a whole lot more we would go into. Other than Betty's comments on clarifying some of that engagement pieces.
I remembered my other main question to do with the OCP. Throughout the RFP, you're talking about the goal to be completed before the end of 2026. Now, can you clarify just what you mean by completed? Is that finally adopted?
Yeah.
Okay, so 2026 is an election year. So it's not the end of 2026. You're going to want it finally adopted before the.
I thought we said August last meeting.
Yeah, so I could change it to 5.
Well, I think it'll make a difference to them. So, yeah.
Really July though, because August is.
Yeah, so I think to the end of July. Remembering, the last time we got a draft came to council from the OCP steering committee. And then there was probably 6 or 8 months we had a new planner, chief planner at that point, and there's probably 6 or 8 months of back and forth with council and amendments. So.
My hope with this process is that council's more involved in this steering committee process than on that review session. So hopefully that then when a draft plan comes before council, at least council
already sort of
along the process and some of but you're right, I do start to go backwards and I go, well, fourth reading to adopted it, then it's like, well, public hearing has to be that far in advance because why Island Trust after public hearing and you start going backwards. Yeah.
Rather than saying completed, you want to say adopted by July, the end of July.
I think that's trickier. I mean,
Well, if that's
the
our
capricious
expectation.
nature of politicians, right? Like
If that is our expectation, and if you're gonna carry it over an election, you might be starting the process all over again.
I just don't know that you can put that in a contract. If I was, I would not be happy signing that.
Well, it just says in here, Bona identified the review of the OCP as a priority with a goal to the comprehensive update completed before the end of 2026. So what's wrong with saying adopted by the end of July 2026? They can come back in their proposals and say that's not doable.
I think the idea that the review is complete when it's complete and the goal of that ends with an adopted bylaw, but ultimately the council and not the consultants. The consultants say, well, we produced the plan. Council considered it at bylaw, the project is complete from their point of view.
So are you gonna change it to the end of July or to the end of June?
So I'll change it to July 2026, or change it to by the middle of 2026. something. Because I don't have council direction for an end date, so I'm not comfortable sort of putting it in a month. You know, it's like, it's not like we have council direction to say by June 30th, 2026, this is done. I don't, so I would just be putting it. And I would imagine any consultant bidding on an OCP review process, like, is aware of municipal election dates, right? Because every community is working on the same schedule. Right.
7.1 background papers, development for engagement discussion. Over to you, Dan.
So what we have on the agenda, which people have pointed out we need to rescan, are essentially the OCP background papers from the 2011 OCP. And we have identified for phase one of this project is producing background papers. We wanted to have discussion with the OCP steering committee about the sort of topics that the committee would want addressed in some form on paper before starting, you know, any sort of engagement or like thinking about next steps. The one update is specific update I have as well is that we've known from the start that we need an updated housing needs report based on new provincial guidelines. And that guides like the 20-year housing projection that comes from that updated housing needs report guides the housing that needs to be included in the OCP, so guides some of the land use planning. And the province last week came up with published their updated guidelines for interim housing needs reports, which was very interesting. It has lots of discussion about how to account for things like suppressed housing need. So traditional housing need projections are like, you know, you sort of look at like, well, we've grown at this %, and so we project that going forward, and that's your growth. And it's trying to say, well, if you're a community that hasn't traditionally developed any housing at all, you've actually suppressed your housing because people, you know, kids have grown up and they've left because there's nowhere to live in the community. And so it's not enough just to like take that static line and project it forward because, well, you're not accounting for some of those other pieces. So they've come up with their interim housing needs report guidelines. They've said that they will be having like an online calculator tool come out in July for municipalities to use. And then Metro Vancouver is coordinating as well to work to do some of the update for the member municipalities. So just today, they asked municipalities if people are interested in having them take the work. And so I said, yes, please do ours. So they were looking at like a July, by mid-July, they would aim to have data, but with the concern being that as we're a smaller municipality, some of the data may be suppressed and it may need to be, we need to figure out some of the data sources that for larger municipalities, it's like published and available, but for Bowen, it may be more tricky. But so potentially by our next meeting, or at the very least by the fall, we would aim to have that interim housing needs report, at least in the draft stage. So the background housing data is one piece, and then looking at other pieces around looking to define some of the density limits in the OCP. So our current OCP has density limits that says we're not going to exceed the residential capacity of the 1996 OCP or the its number of primary dwellings that are in the 1996 OCP. But trying to put some of that together for this committee and looking at as well like what are provincial population projections for Bowen. What are the implications of that going forward? And yeah, but we're going to open it up to the committee if there were other topics that we should be delving into.
I guess,
Absolutely.
I'm curious, are there any new large development plans coming through? Because am I remembering correctly that in the old OCP, like Grafton was included in there?
Yeah, Grafton was an OCP amendment in 2017.
So do we have to be aware of any large developments coming through?
New ones on the radar.
So we have a current OCP amendment application in for a campsite that you may have heard of. Other than that, we don't have other large OCP amendment applications that are in. I would say like staff have had like continuing discussions with people about potential applications.
Yeah, we're not really at the, we're not really able to discuss those openly because they're not actual applications, so.
But my question was, do we have to consider potential large development that is within? For exercise, no, that just comes up as and when for count.
Well, anything that is already in the hopper is worth being considered, but otherwise applicants are still able to put forward application while this is occurring. And if the council can choose to say, well, we believe the OCP work needs to be completed before we're willing to consider such a significant amendment to the existing OCP. Or to continue to forward or to continue to approve such an amendment because they may believe that it wouldn't actually be that detrimental to the ongoing work, or for whatever reason council may wish to approve.
Like we got one OCP amendment application on Hummingbird Road Lane that was referred to council to the OCP review process. So it was essentially one lot that was looking to have an OCP amendment to subdivide into two, which would require an OCP amendment, and council referred it to this process to OCP. I forget the wording of the motion, but referred it to the OCP review. So I would think if we have other applications like that, probably when we're talking about whatever is the appropriate form of it, that's like land use and housing, we'd be talking about, and so like, you know, the committee be aware of these applications that have come in referred to this process. Does that make sense?
I think the answer is no.
Yeah.
I understand that, you know, we don't have, that's not something we have.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a tricky one, like.
That's because that the OCP has to respond, council has to respond to those types of developments, and then they do an OCP. So I think the answer is no.
Or maybe not yet.
Or not yet. Except for perhaps we need to have a discussion at some point about campsites, I guess.
Or I guess too, it's like.
But anyways, let's move on.
You know, like through the stakeholder list, we're looking at identifying like developers, landholders. And there's potential like people are coming and say, well, I own, you know, this is future development site, this is what I want to do.
In terms of background papers, it doesn't sound like you need to produce a background paper on upcoming. Develop. So, okay, so that's it. I guess I'd be curious to know if there's, if it's worthwhile that the committee to get an update on what's happening with community lands. Because I think that's a good, if we're going to be talking about density and housing, community lands, so what the future of the community lands need to be pulled into the OCP. That would be one question I had. Infrastructure. Brought up to date on infrastructure and.
What is this infrastructure?
But what, and within what, I guess, breaking down what think of it as water, roads, all what.
I got Councilor Morris, Adam, and then Fritz.
So a couple of comments in relation to Melvin's question. I think there is still a big rezoning we're waiting for and have been waiting for since 2011 for the lands around the Seymour Bay and around the golf course and up to Seymour Bay Drive and in that area. So that's something that we know is coming at some point, but whether that gets dealt with. And I guess the developer could have the choice of saying, I'd like this to be looked at through the OCP process. I mean, council's got three choices, I think, with amendments. No, we don't want to consider it as part of the OCP process, or because it's so small and simple, deal with it. I don't know what there is left in the way of large tracts of undeveloped land, because the other one I can see is the piece out in Blue Water, Menzies property. I don't know whether that's going to require an OCP amendment or not.
Adam?
I think just a quick follow-up to Natalie's comment about the infrastructure and servicing part, and kind of the sequence of work for these. Because it's gonna be a big lift to develop all these papers. Maybe prioritizing the ones that are gonna be most useful at the beginning, so like the housing and the population and the servicing stuff, and then transfer of density and DCCs are kind of maybe more in the options development, like a little later in the process, so just kind of focusing on the key ones to start.
Yeah, I'd like to want to say something about the population growth, and I looked at the minutes of our last meeting, and I looked at the scenario planning, and I think maybe we should do that, because I find this statistics somewhat useless, to be honest. It's always based on old numbers, and it's also based on old basis of why that number is out there in 1996, right? We all know where it came from. It's just a number of lots, number of houses times 2.3 people per lot, you know what I mean? And that's a number. Again, that has no relationship to what we need now. It's just a number, and you either accept that number or not. But I thought maybe you can calculate what the population in a different way. Like if we say that one scenario is, imagine Bowen Island the way you want it to be, like 10 years, 20 years from now, whatever. And then you see maybe that there's somewhere else a small village, let's say at Seymour Bay or so, and different scenarios. Then you can figure out who has to be there, like what's missing. And if you calculate it out, I think even if the calculations are wrong, they're going to be much higher than the numbers that you see here. So I find this actually looking at the past and taking something from the past that is not necessarily correct. In my mind, it's somewhat meaningless. And then say, well, it's going to go 2% per year or so, and then you have a number. But it's clear to me that if you wouldn't have any numbers and you just start building what Bowen needs, that it will be scooped up in no time. It's all single family that we have, so it's so clear what is missing. I think a lot of these numbers are there to justify decisions. For instance, if you want to obtain funding from the province or from the federal government, you need numbers, you need data, right? But the data has to also actually reflect what we need.
Thank you.
No?
I'm gonna go in the weeds a little bit here just for 2 seconds, because I agree with what you're saying, that you envision what you've got in the future, because where I'm curious of how we start to give some issues, and you brought up the OCP amendment, potential for Hummingbird Lane, right? And that I think was to take a large lot to subdivide it into two. And that didn't get, but if you're looking, I think there'll be a lot of pushback to do that, because we're gonna start seeing fragmentation of these larger lots, but it's something that is required to meet where we want to be in 10 years, which is perhaps more housing closer to the code, and so we might have to look into different approach. So I guess this is where I'm curious of what where do we go? I guess I don't know, for these background papers. What else do we need?
So, and I think.
I'm confused, I guess, it's like, what more knowledge do we need to understand the options?
I'm gonna go Daniel and then Kristen.
I think for me, in terms of the population housing piece, where it's like most important for me is based on the new provincial legislation that says like ROCP has to provide the 20-year projected housing need that's in the housing needs support. It's like provincially mandated that ROCP provide that, like a minimum that amount of housing for future housing need. And so I'm like, okay, well, to know that, we need to know, okay, what's the current almost like capacity on Bowen, like how much Bowen capacity is there? And then what's the 20-year housing projected need? How many units do we need, and do we currently have that number available on Bowen or not? Because if the answer is no, then we're saying, okay, well then the new OCP has to include additional housing permission to some extent. And that's not to say that like, well, if the vision for Bowen is greater than that, it can do that, but it can't be less than that. But right now I couldn't sit here offhand and tell you, oh, well, there's 200 units available on Bowen, and our 20-year housing projected need is 250, so we need to add 50 units somewhere. I just don't know that right now. So for me, it's like I need to do that background work. Yeah, to have an OCP that is like meets provincial legislation.
Yeah, so I mean, when I think of the background papers too, I tend to think of it as it's giving that high level criteria for people to then understand and then to brainstorm ideas. So if, you know, and so it's, I think it's for us, we can get really into the weeds, we can get really detailed. But I think for us to really unpack what are those big block criterias that then allow some creativity. So even saying densification needs to be around the cove, well, maybe there are those on the other side of the island who would want to see a commercial center and densification on the other side of the island to reduce the congestion. It's now cove. Not to say that's necessarily my idea, or maybe it is, but but you know, I think that's what we're trying to do is get those creative ideas. And I think it's up to us to just then articulate in the simplest way so that people want to participate. Because I think if it gets really too detailed or really too restrictive in our assumptions, it's not going to lead to some creative, some creative ideas coming from the community. But that is the challenge. Like certainly housing is one of those big criteria blocks. Certainly, I think for infrastructure, there are some limitations. And again, there are some plans as well. But again, those are those big criteria blocks to look at. And then certainly some of the opportunities that have been flagged before that we could carry over again, like thinking of Seymour Bay as another criteria block and then to imagine what that looks like.
Jenna.
And maybe just a little curious what folks think about background documents on how things are going to be funded in the future. I don't know if that's the responsibility or a mandate of this committee or whether that's just staff and council, but certainly if there's anything we can do as a committee to support staff and council, then that's something I'd really like to learn a little bit more about.
Just a quick question, Chana. When you say how things are going to be funded, can you expand on that?
Yeah, Liam, that's a good clarification. It would be really around how the municipality is going to like seek funding sources to implement some of the programs or recommendations that come out of the OCP. So just sort of understanding like what are the big buckets from federal to provincial to other buckets that can be accessed to help us fund what I guess presume will be infrastructure needs to support divisions that are coming through with this OCP. So just more curious whether that's of interest to anybody, because I know I've expressed that, but maybe that's not of interest or of the mandate of the committee. And if that's the case, then I'm happy to just sort of quietly do that on my own.
If I may, I think it's a really good question. I mean, you can build yourself a beautiful blue sky future. If you can't finance it, then it's never going to be a reality. And we're facing that right now with the development pressure in the cove because of the limitations of the current capacity of infrastructure. And so it is a worthwhile question to ask. Not sure that the committee is this committee's job to dive too deep into that, but at least at a high level, I think it's a worthy question.
Adam and then Fritz.
Just a quick follow-up to that. I think I would caution, like, I think it's like a relevant and important consideration. I also think an OCP is like a visionary document for the future that fundamentally should not be constrained by current servicing challenges. We don't know the funding scenario 15 years from now, 10 years from now. And I think like philosophically not the purpose of an OCP.
And it's a leadership and an ideal rather than a blueprint.
Yes. If I may, I agree. I love the idea if OCPs are visionary. I just do believe there have to be some grounding in the financial projections. So we've had this discussion at a staff level. If the community says density needs to occur in the code, we then have to answer the question like, how do we pay for that? That's great. And so I think we got to be honest with the community when we go and say, well, how do you want to grow and develop over the next 20 years? And because if you want to go this way, that's going to cost a lot of money. If you want to go this way, maybe that's more affordable or there's other mechanisms. So I think I wouldn't want to constrain it with the nitty gritty details and we'll chase whatever senior government funding is available all times. But I wouldn't want to be getting into I think ultimately the primary revenue stream is tax base. You cannot rely on senior government funding to develop your plans. And as the guy who used to approve things like DCCs, and if you had grant funding in your DCC financial model, we said, take it out. Just don't want to see that. So, but it's an important part of the conversation.
Well, no, like I certainly agree. I guess what I'm saying is like, it should be a consideration that we daylight and socialize when we talk about land use and where to allocate and those types of things, just not initially.
Adam, that's the perfect word. I would not use, like, I wouldn't be endorsing any sort of constraining environment. Actually, but I like your word of consideration. And so that's what I would be advocating for. And that's something to think about here. Thank you.
Fritz and then James and Glenn.
I think Adam said really well what I wanted to say, but then I thought I'd give an example. If we reach out to the community, we're going to tell them what all the restrictions are. Now we want to hear from them what they envision. So you have to keep it open. That's the whole process. And I say, well, if we want to trigger people thinking about it, then if you go back to scenario planning, you have some questions and say, well, it could be like this or it could be like that, and a bit extreme. Now you get your answers.
James?
Yeah, just weighing in a bit on this. I think I agree with those who are saying there it is a constraint that we can't ignore. And so I would, as much as I like to do some blue skying, I'd want to know that there's some and we talked a little bit about scenarios of saying that there's a real plausible scenario of saying how is either A, we can't afford it or never would be able to afford it, or there is a way, or something that grounds it, and not just in infrastructure. I think there's going to be some other areas that I would hope then, this my main point is sort of as we look to all these background papers, that there's going to be a component of it around the financial implications of whatever it is that are being considered. And the reality around how and whether or not we can afford it. Like your point, I mean, I think we all got our tax bill recently. Is that where that is a constraint, and we need to be realistic about how much in these times, and be realistic about how much infrastructure is. There's a little project that's a little over budget in North Vancouver, some of you may have heard about. That's a reality, and it may be our reality into the future. And so I think it can't be just blue skying. It has to be about what is the financial reality. And where I think that should come into is some aspect of whether or not it, in probably all the background papers that it would be relevant to.
Thank you, James. Glenn?
I kind of echoed Jim and what Liam said. It is a reality that we can't ignore. I think it comes down to a communication style. Like, we can either frame it as this is a limitation and a barrier that can't be overcome, but to be visionary, it's more of the reality of saying this is something that we can overcome. You have choices to make, right? Like, it can still be spun in a positive way, but it is a reality, and that can't be ignored. But I think it's a vision style goal that
Fritz?
I still want to say something about like, for instance, if you look at the resources that are used now, right? I'm an architect who builds some really big houses here for clients, and they use a lot of resources, right? So I think within even existing resources, if the zoning wouldn't allow all of that to happen, right? Some of these goals can be achieved. Like for instance, like a lot of towns will say a walkable village, right? What does that mean, right? That means that there is more small homes, and therefore, so I think you can actually, I find, don't restrict yourself too soon, because like you're, how much resources are out as a community, right? And how would you, the OCP should say, this is where we want to go, and maybe you only can take one step in the next few years. But I think it has to reflect what the community wants. Let it reflect what the community wants. Okay? I mean, like maybe it's financially not feasible. I don't think it really matters. You need to take the steps that you can take. But we're sitting in an environment that is very, all these lots are the whole subdivision are created in the 50s and the 60s. You know, so you can think about it and change it.
I want a Ferrari, but I can't afford it. And you're an architect, surely you've worked with a lot of clients who have had a vision and gone through the effort of creating plans. And then they create plans that they can't afford and they walk away from it. That's happened endless times too, right? So I think a vision's good, but the reality of how to achieve it, I think is, I'll echo it again. I think it's very important.
I'm just gonna zoom us out here a little bit for a couple of comments. I think, you know, this discussion is a great one. I think it's one that will continue in an ongoing way as the process unfolds. And the reality is that, you know, every member of this committee is a member of the community and brings the experience of what it's like to live in this community and what will work and what will not work. So I think it's important to recognize that there's like implicit, you know, biases through experience that we have. That's just naturally going to inform that conversation of like, oh, well, what's going to work and what's not going to work on the island. You know, I can't imagine this committee is going to be like, okay, we've almost built a community center. We're going to tack on a skating rink and a swimming pool, and you know, we should build, you know, 40-story high rises. Like it's, you know, I think there's just a reality check that we have being members of the community that is going to be filtered through as this stuff, as the work moves on. The other piece, just the presence here, is that it's really a conversation around, or what I'm hearing in the conversation, it's like, well, how aspirational do we want to be versus how, you know, financially realistic is it? And until we get into those conversations of, okay, well, what are the actual policies and the mechanics that we're putting into this OCP? You know, I don't know if we'll know. So, you know, some of like, what does it take to rezone something? Not a whole lot. Or is this committee going to move into a direction of where it actually wants to recommend programs and services and infrastructure? Because that's a different conversation. The balance between, you know, what I hear from staff, like, oh my God, this is actually going to take money and it's going to take time and it's going to take resources, and you know, Liam's really the stopgap and the control to make sure that, you know, council's not running around in some green field of projects and programs and services versus something aspirational. Like, you know, Adam's got experience of TransLink, and TransLink has its 10-year priorities, which are all unfunded right now. It's 10-year priorities that represent a $2 billion investment in the region in public transit and active transportation and greenway projects. But what that vision does is for the decision makers at the table, whether it's the TransLink board or the mayor's council, it's like, okay, well, we've got something to work towards. And this is the direction that we get to move in. And then as decision makers, that frames our discussion and conversations and where we want to go. And that's really what an OCP is going to do. When we think of 4 years from now, this next council that's going to come in, and you know, thanks to Councillor Morris, this is going to be adopted by summer 2026. The next council that comes in, what the OCP does, it's like it focuses that vision for council and for staff, and it's that interpretive lens. It's not necessarily a roadmap, but it feels more like a compass that we can evaluate direction against. Those are just my thoughts and observations from the discussion so far. Other comments, questions? Okay. Any closing comments here, Daniel, on this item? Perhaps then, just on the heels of that discussion of 6.1, which is the work plan follow-up, and 7.1, which is these background papers, looking forward to the next meeting. So what are pieces that you'd like to bring to the committee, Daniel, or pieces that you're going to frame up for us next in this work plan, particularly for July 29th before we close for the summer break?
My plan at this point initially is like RFP responses. Assuming this is posted and we don't have to postpone it. I mean, responses have been made from Monday. Part of the meeting will be a closed meeting to go over big responses. We may, potentially have housing needs report or at least some form of update on that front. And then I haven't put my mind to thinking about, speaker. I know sort of our goal has been, we have the initial speakers list and think about speakers coming for some of the items on the lenses in particular for the OCP review. I don't know if it's worth having Joe Elliott back again. If people have more questions, we could see if he's available to have more Q&A time or visit other topics.
Just quick, I guess dependent on the housing needs stuff from Metro, but maybe somebody from housing in Metro. If only to share them to what they developed and walk us through it, might be helpful.
Yeah, right. I think John can okay with maybe.
Yeah.
Just a quick note, just going back a little bit, I figured out the First Nation consultation map that Claire Fraser had referred to. It took me a while to figure it out.
Are you emailing it too?
It's not easily emailable. It's like an interactive GIS map. It has the list that she. That one, yeah. Is that link publicly available? Oh, yeah. I'll do a copy of all of the contact tribes nations that were identified, but that list is consistent with.
Great. 7.2 other business. We have a discussion on the chair and the leadership of this committee. So a couple of framing comments. You folks saw the email that I sent out, and then we had a discussion at council on Monday. And councillors, if what I'm about to say is out of whack, feel free to let me know. I think we've got a quorum of council here. We've 5, or Judy's gone, but we have 5 out of 7 at one point. The sense is that it still feels like leadership of the committee needs to emerge, and that we're still at early stages. So the comments that I got range from many very supportive of sure, Andrew, you should be the chair, and I would support that. And then a couple of cautionary comments around, do we want council to really have a strong leadership of the committee, and I think the balance there is that I would agree. I still feel like I'm keeping this chair warm, but there is a need. I don't like making decisions, and I really don't like council making decisions when it feels like we're rushed and we're just trying to make a decision for the sake of making a decision. So council has resolved in the interim that myself and Councillor Jurgensen will be the chair and vice chair of the committee, possibly until the fall, to give us some more time just to see what's happening let the committee gel a little bit. And then the intention is like when I look at how the committee is going to unfold, we're still in sort of introductory work and introductory phases. We've got the RFP going, we've got, you know, some framing, some education, and then, you know, my hope is that by the time the committee is really taking over the nitty gritty work, that myself and Councillor Ferguson can step back. And Melanie, I know that you added it to the agenda, but
Yeah, just to get some conversation going about that would really, I've seen the emails going around and I had been planning on, if you hadn't have brought that new information to light, and I was going to put a motion, perhaps I was very much in favor of or supportive of you continuing on to be committee chair. And I was just going to just, in response to other comments from other committee members, suggest maybe for a 1 year, you know, but you've already, you know, had discussions about bringing to the fall. That's for me, that sits very well. Personally, I think for a committee and a project like this, it really needs strong leadership and strong involvement from council to really pull it through the mud. There's a long journey to go. So, so those were my comments. I just wanted to be able to bring it. I just wanted to have the committee to have a conversation about. That's why I put it on the agenda.
right, and, you know, I would see my role until something changes. You know, my role here as chair is really as a space holder for what wants to come up and what wants to emerge. You know, maybe I'll offer some reflections and reframing pieces and provide the council view, but I would see my role as chair as it moves into the future now really as a space holder, you know, to hold space for what wants to emerge and arise from this committee. If anybody's prepared and ready to go, I'm happy to coach you on Robert's Rules of Order and be a chair. Yeah.
On the question of like the timing for when that could happen, my only thought on that is that ideally before first public engagement. Just because I think again, I'm like very appreciative of the offer and the role and the risk in terms of like public perception and this being a community member advisory committee.
Yeah.
And there needing to be at least the perception that we're providing like some separation between council and this committee.
And if heaven forbid we went into the next election season, then that starts to look murky pretty quick too. Like, I know you wouldn't be crazy enough to run again, but
You never know. Never say never.
Yeah, and totally agree with that. You know, and the other thing I'm sensitive to is that you know, myself being in a political role, like things are going well politically for me right now. But who knows what issue?
Don't say that.
Right? But obviously, who knows what issue could come out of that in the community? Who knows, like maybe there's another campsite, maybe there's something else. I don't know. And I think there is value in this committee being, the leadership of this committee being shielded from whatever, you know, political fallout can happen. I don't know what the issues are going to be in the future, but again, and what I just got your hand, Betty. And what I will say is that in terms of like emergent kind of processes and democratic processes, like I have a feeling there's going to come a time when this committee gels and it'll just feel like the time to hand it off. Maybe that's before first engagement or something like that. Like there's something that still feels like it's ripening here. And once that's ripe, I think everybody will kind of feel the texture around the room of like, oh, okay, we're ready to take this on our own. And we can do that from there. Betty?
I guess question first and rationale second. Does the chair have to be already on the committee? Because I think a lot of us saw that sort of formative, creative opportunity to be part of this process. And we're probably quite committed to that. And what you do so well as a chair is don't tell us what to think, but just adjudicate the meeting and perhaps summarize afterwards, but unless we ask you to, you don't really insert yourself into the conversation. So to me, it's a very different role, and I think somebody could lead this group really well with really proficient skills. But I'm not sure, it's apparent that none of us really want to jump into that place right now.
So I would just offer, give us some thought, but, you know, again, this, like, how would I frame this?
Put on the agenda from the.
Put it back on the agenda and like, you can always.
Every meeting.
We just, you're interim chair for now, and we'll just come and revisit it, and we just definitely have something put together before first public engagement.
Yeah, and all I would say is that there's nothing stopping the committee from making recommendations as to the form of the committee. So if you wanted to add somebody else to the committee, or if you thought there was somebody external to this body that would be a good chair, you could even look at, you want to get really like, so like process nerdery, like you can even adopt a different rules of order, kind of more like consensus building rules of order, like those exist out there. So however this committee wants to function, none of it is set in stone. I think there's, in governance, sometimes there's the notion that like this is the way it has to be done, and it's a real right angle sort of way of thinking. But that can clash with a process like this, where it needs to be creative, emergent, dynamic. Things need to shift. So if there's ideas that you folks have that you want to change the process, change the composition, change the way that this works, that's ultimately going to be your decision to self-actualize. And there's nothing stopping you from bringing that to council, from editing the terms of reference, from looking at it. Council Morrison.
I've been, I guess, considering the position that Andrew's filling as more as a meeting facilitator. Not a chair would typically be very involved in maybe helping set the agenda and reviewing minutes and things like that, but more just a meeting facilitator position.
Just a quick follow-up, I completely agree with Eddie's comments, on kind of our roles and what we're hoping to do. I mentioned it in the email that I sent this morning, but just a suggestion, like we could consider a rotating chair.
Oh, yeah.
If it is to be somebody within this, or some within this group, that maybe we move that responsibility around instead, maybe of bringing somebody in, but also.
That's the kind of creative thinking that we brought.
There's also the idea of dividing up the role, that we have people that are interested in taking on sections of it without responsibility for the whole thing. I think we all have stuff to do and
And all volunteered for those background reports.
Great, so this will come back to us in the fall at some point. Section 8 is information items, so without objection, we will receive those, unless there's any comments from staff on the information items. Strategic plan and example RFPs.
Yeah, that's the whole agenda from last time, just to, if people wanted to refer to those for this RFP discussion.
I don't see anybody in the room here for question period. Is anybody online?
No one's online.
Next meeting is Monday, July 29th, 2024 at 11 a.m. And with that, I will look for a motion to adjourn. That's perfect. Nancy Ferris. Who wants to make a motion to adjourn? By David, seconded by Melanie. All in favor, raise your hand, say aye. And we are adjourned. Thank you so much for spending your Tuesday morning with us. I appreciate the discussion.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Well,